Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Jeffrey Gertz, Senior Fellow here at CNAS. Delighted to welcome you all to a launch event for the new CNAS report, Disorderly Conduct, How U.S. China Competition Upended the International Economic Order and What the United States Can Do to Fix It. So this is a major new report based on a couple of years, really, of research on the U.S. China trade and economic relationship. I think there's sort of two key starting points here. One is that security is increasingly central to the U.S. China economic relationship. So if you look at debates over trade wars, over technology competition, the debate around de-risking versus decoupling, we see security concerns are often defining the terms of the U.S. China economic relationship. Second, at the same time, I think we see the U.S. China economic relationship is central, not only to the broader bilateral relationship between U.S. and China, but really to the global international economic order and to global peace and prosperity. And there are real risks that the U.S.-China economic competition can be a source of global instability. So the stakes are really high in getting this right. So the report that we are launching today really looks in detail at how can the United States develop a strategic framework that serves our core economic and security interest in the U.S.-China economic relationship. So delighted to have a fantastic panel here to discuss these issues. We have Emily Kilcrease, who's Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy Economics and Security Program at CNAS and the lead author of today's report. Emily is an expert on U.S.-China economic relationship, the alignment of national security objectives and economic policy, and geoeconomic statecraft. Before joining CNAS, she served as Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative overseeing U.S. foreign investment policy. Welcome, Emily. We also have Peter Harrell, who's a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and an attorney in private practice who advises on economic sanctions and other international regulatory matters. Among other things, Peter has a great paper out last month for the Carnegie Endowment on resetting U.S. trade policy, which maybe we'll get into a little bit. Earlier in the Biden administration, Harrell served at the White House as Senior Director for International Economics, jointly appointed to the National Security Council and National Economic Council. And finally, we also are joined by Adam Tong, who's Associate Fellow in the Energy Economics and Security Program at CNAS. Adam's work focuses on U.S.-China economic competition, China's economic statecraft, and sanction resilience. Before joining CNAS, Adam was an analyst at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So before we jump into the discussion here, a couple of housekeeping matters up front. First, the audio of this recording will appear as a bonus episode for the new podcast that Emily and I recently launched called De-Risky Business. So it's a podcast that goes in depth on economic security issues, featuring interviews with top policymakers and other experts. So if you are watching live today and have not yet checked out De-Risky Business, please do, and you'll find this episode in the feed next week, I believe. Second, definitely, as we go on, very much welcome questions from the audience for our panelists. So if you have a question, please sort of use the chat box to see on the bottom there, cnas.org/live, and we'll sort of filter those questions in as we go and make sure we have time for them at the end. All right, so let's kick off. Emily, over to you. Maybe you could say just a little bit on sort of the motivation for this report. So what were you trying to achieve in this and why sort of now is the time to pull this together?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thanks to Peter and, of course, my co-author, Adam, for joining today. Really excited to get into this conversation. And I do want to give a big thanks as well to our publications team, Mara McCarthy, Caroline Steele, Rin Rothbach, and Melanie Cook, who did an amazing job putting the report together and wrangling some very gnarly graphs for us. So if the report looks good, hopefully our substance will be equally as good. But why this project and why this report? So as you hinted at, this is the culmination of a multi-year project we've had running at CNAS to look at the rise of security issues within the bilateral U.S.-China economic relationship, because it's one of the biggest fundamental shifts that we've seen in the geopolitical context, at least from our perspective, over the last 2 decades. If you look back to when China acceded to the WTO, we were in just a fundamentally different place geopolitically. There was this real economic logic to integrate China into a rules-based trading system, a belief that could change China. That's not where we are today, right? So if you look at the numbers, and we include this in the report, by any measure, the bilateral economic relationship has become heavily securitized. We're increasingly seeing national security risks arising out of economic entanglement with China. And we're increasingly trying to use economic tools to manage national security risks that we have with China, or that we assess with the relationship with China. And that's making the economic piece of things very complicated. So you can look at, for example, entity list designation. So the technology blacklisting that we do of specific Chinese companies. You could look at sanctions designations. You can look at how many times the US government blocks Chinese acquisitions of US businesses through our CFIUS process. all of those numbers have just gone straight up over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And so what does that mean for an open market? What does that mean for a rules-based trading system? I think it's gotten much more complicated. And then layer on top of that, the hard experience of the pandemic, the heightened concern that policymakers have on resiliency and supply chain security. All of a sudden, we're in this moment where we don't have what we used to have in the economic space, which was a general presumption of openness and integration and free markets with just itty-bitty rooms for exceptions for government intervention for a small range of policy reasons. All of a sudden, that dichotomy doesn't work anymore. So what does the trading system need to move towards? What does the global economic order need to move towards? And how do we, because it is a global problem, but even within this global problem, how do we think about managing that very consequential relationship with China to advance both U.S. economic interests and our security interests? So that was the motivation for the report. We had a working group that ran for 2 years to bring together the economic and the trade community with the security experts, because there's a lot of translation that needs to happen between those communities a lot of times, and we're trying to bridge that gap. I also wanted to note that we, as part of this project, coordinated a group of essays from experts in this field to kind of supplement and complement the analysis that's in our disorderly conduct report. And so if you go to the CNAS.org website, you can find the essays from those external authors as well, who did a fantastic job kind of lending their own view to these issues. So that was the motivation, and here we are with the final launch today.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Emily. So we'll sort of jump into the kind of forward-looking strategy pieces in a second. But first, maybe as a bit of context, that would be helpful to look back. I think the report has a fair bit sort of looking back on how we got to this stage. And really specifically, we can look sort of from, sort of around 2001, kind of China entering the WTO moment. There's sort of real optimism, real belief that kind of engagement with China was going to serve, both our economic and our sort of broader political and security interests. I think, certainly that was a consensus position back in 2001. We now probably have the sort of opposite consensus that sort of really didn't work out. But maybe hear a bit from all three of you on sort of kind of what went wrong from that 2001, sort of how, was it always predestined to get to this point, or sort of what are the steps that kind of took us from that moment of optimism of WTO entry to where we are today? So start with you, Emily, and then we'll go to Peter and Adam.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, I'm not here to kind of Monday morning quarterback the decision to, push for China's WTO accession. I think there's a real logic to why the U.S. found it to be in its interest at the time, just given where we were politically, given that China was not the military competition that it is today. It was just a different relationship. And we've tried a lot of different ways to try to manage the change in that relationship and the rise of the security interests within that relationship over, the 2.5 decades since that point, right? So we've tried dialogues, we've tried all sorts of different flavors of dialogues, and I think there's some real limitations to how much that's been able to motivate or kind of push China for change. We've tried binding China with rules through the WTO. We had a period of time where we were negotiating a bilateral investment treaty, but the rules seem more fragile than we would like in the context of an intense geopolitical competition. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing this real rise in what we call the defensive toolkit, right? So the export controls, the tariffs, the things that we can do unilaterally without having to negotiate with China. And they're the things that we feel like we must do. Maybe they're a second best option, but we must do them in order to protect US security and economic interests. And so that's really been this big shift in how we've kind of used different tactics based on where our ultimate strategic objective is. We're not trying to change China anymore, but what we are trying to do is manage this relationship in a responsible way to protect our own interest. And that has led to this huge increase in the defensive toolkit.
Great, thanks. Peter, what are your thoughts on sort of how we got from 2001 to today?
Yeah, let me pick up first on a point that Emily made, which is I don't want to Monday morning quarterback decisions that were made now, 25, 28 years ago. And looking back at them, I think at the time, much as Emily said, they weren't crazy bets to make at the time. They were reasonable bets to make. You had a country that clearly was growing economically. Remember also, it was much smaller economically then, right? In 2000, it was maybe 12 or 15% the size of U.S. GDP. It was not the sort of 60, 70% you see today. So you had a much smaller but growing country. You had actually some relatively reformist-minded leaders in China at the time who did seem to be taking some steps to liberalize economically and as well as politically. And then I also think you had a lot of optimism here in the US about kind of two trends that at the time we thought would take root in China. One optimism being this kind of view we have in the US that ultimately economic liberalization and political liberalization are linked. And the more you have kind of, as Bill Clinton said in speeches on China in the 90s, the more you have kind of small businesses and small entrepreneurs taking root in China, that would ultimately prod and facilitate political liberalization. And I think there was also a lot of time at the time, there was a lot of optimism about what the spread of the internet was going to do in China. You know, there were nascent efforts to control the internet in the late 90s, but Bill Clinton at the time said, oh, you know, controlling the internet is going to be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. And so there was really this optimism about what was going on in China, which was not totally crazy. There was optimism about some tools of American strength and statecraft. And so there's a view of, well, you know, let's give them a framework they can come into with the WTO, with another set of rules and kind of the trade and geoeconomic space that will ultimately, you know, encourage reform, continued path of reform and opening in China, and what you know was called through much of the 2000s kind of encouraging China to be a responsible stakeholder within the existing system. I think was not a crazy bet at the time. You know, looking back on it, it probably was a bit naive. You know, China succeeded in nailing Jell-O to the wall with the internet and, you know, developing a censorship and kind of domestic propaganda architecture to build support for a much more authoritarian leaning country, and found ways to kind of use technology to control populations domestically. And then, of course, with Xi Jinping consolidating power in the early 2010s, I do think, whereas prior Chinese leadership was liberalizing, you then saw an increasingly repressive leadership in China. And so, you know, that's just a reality of how that played out. I think we both didn't understand that repressive leadership might come back, and we didn't understand that if and when it did come back, how effective it could be at building a more authoritarian, both internally and externally forceful system. And so, you know, the story of the last several years has really been, you know, kind of adjusting to that new reality we now face with China.
Great, thanks. Adam, I know you've sort of spent a lot of time sort of thinking about and studying sort of China's thoughts on these and responses to it, kind of, you know, from your point of view, kind of how do you think that sort of some of these ideas are viewed in China, and again, sort of some of the debate around responsible stakeholder and how much China's activities have or have not shifted there?
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Emily and Peter, for your comments, and especially Emily for leading this great project. I've learned so much in the process. So I would say that, you know, it's not entirely wrong to say that there was valid convergence of interest at the time, right? At least at the beginning. From the economic perspective, I think Beijing's main interests in the WTO accession are really twofold. I think at the time, the leadership really thought that it's good for the economy to respond to perhaps stronger market signals. And reform camp policymakers intended to use the concessions that China had to make for the WTO as a sort of a external pressure to push through internal reforms that were considered too difficult or unrealistic at the time. And the second challenge for the economy at the time really was the Asian financial crisis. China, on the eve of the crisis, was not quite the global manufacturing hub that it would become, but already nearly 40% of its economy was tied to the international markets, particularly with countries in Asia. So again, the WTO was perceived as this a new ticket to further expand China's possibility to expand export markets in the world. But in China, of course, the urge to keep a sizable, if not prominent, role for the state in the economy was always lurking. Concerns about the country being stuck at the lower end of the global supply chain became quite clear as early as 2003 and 2004. So one argument at the time was that China should play more by the rules and just simply use its vast market to attract foreign technology as a way to keep up. Others, however, argued that a stronger interventionist policy was needed. And the net result of that was the National Medium to Long-Term Plan for the Development of Science and Technology in 2006. And that laid the foundation for stronger interventions going forward. And of course, a watershed moment, of course, was the global financial crisis. China escaped the crisis relatively unscathed, and this created a sense of triumphalism in country. But part of Beijing's massive fiscal stimulus quickly found new expressions in specific industries and frontier technologies, with local governments competing for central government resources, national resources, seeking to convert the stimulus into more of a permanent industrial programs with longer term benefits for local GDP. And so I think that played a significant part into a new wave of industrial policies in the 2010s, this time focused on strategic and emerging industries. And also as China began to confront this challenge of middle income country trap in earnest at the time, it paid close attention to Germany's Industry 4.0 plan. But of course, China promulgated Made in China 2025, partly inspired by the German plan, but of course with much more stronger spending and government guidance. And so I think we do see this initial alignment of interest in the econ domain slowly diverging. And really, I think the urge to develop its own path in China can be seen fairly early, right after 2001.
Great, thanks, Adam. So that's a kind of quick synopsis of some of the history, how we got here. Again, sort of commend the full report to everyone who wants to sort of dig more into the details here. Lots of great material there. But I think we want to sort of shift the conversation a little bit to looking forward, looking kind of, how does the U.S. need to adjust its strategy and kind of come up with a new strategy here. So maybe, Emily, over to you. If you could kind of give a quick walkthrough of sort of what are the core recommendations that come out of the report for how the U.S. should update its strategy on China's economic policy.
Yeah, I'll kind of bucket this into two pieces. The first is how we think about this intersection of economic and security interests. We previously had this dichotomy of like everything is presumed towards openness. We have a bias towards openness and integration, as I mentioned before, and then like just a bit of exceptions for national security interest. But what we're finding over the last, decade or so is that there's so much economic activity that governments now want to like put through these national security exceptions or put these essential security exceptions. And to be clear, like I'm not talking specifically or just about, things that where, activities where the governments may formally invoke an essential security exception under the WTO. It's more governments are intervening in the economy to a much greater extent. They're often justifying it on national security grounds. But that's getting really muddy because we're doing a lot more in that space, right? So one of the big components of our report is a recommendation to kind of reconceptualize how we think about that. It's no longer just open economics or national security. We recommend a different articulation of our interests along three lines. So we think the first one is around U.S. hard power interests. So these are the economic activities that implicate our ability to prevail on the battlefield. And our objective here is not a level playing field, right? Like we do not want a level playing field if and when we were ever in a military conflict with China. And therefore, when we're talking about our hard power interests, that's not our objective. Our objective is overmatch, right? We want to be better at China than at advanced chip production. We want to be better than China at all of the technical components that go into an advanced modernized military. And so that's a very specific set of economic activities and a specific set of policy tools that should be used to pursue that overmatch. That's where you see, I think, the most aggressive toolkit being used. So that's export controls, that's outbound investment screening, et cetera. Potentially, in some cases, it might be sanctions. That's much different than what we call our second bucket, which is resiliency interests. And this is where we're starting to see governments really want to intervene in the name of making sure that their economy is resilient, making sure that their society has access to the goods and services it needs, and that it can withstand shocks. So you're not going to use export controls for resiliency interests, probably. Maybe you're going to use industrial policy. Maybe you're going to use tariffs in some cases, right? Like there's a whole different toolkit to pursue our resiliency interests that should be very different than our hard power interests. And then you have a third bucket of interest, which we call the commercial interest. This is basically everything else, right? Like this is the non-strategic stuff. This is your soda pop and your shoes and your toys. And their objective is a level playing field, right? Like there might be a role for government intervention, but it's really just to neutralize any trade distortive policies of other governments. We really shouldn't be messing with those markets too much. So we think we need to kind of reconceptualize this whole idea of how we think about the role of government in the economy according to these three interests of hard power interest, resiliency interest, and commercial interests. Now, our trading architecture, our systems, our institutions are not set up to accommodate that right now, right? So that's the other big component of the recommendation section is how do we get there, right? Like, so there's a big need, we think, for norm building, even within the United States, to kind of reorient how we think about economic policy and trade policy along those lines. Part of that might be filling in some of the toolkit, particularly around resiliency interests, right? Like that's the conversation we're having around IRA. I think there's a lot more work that can be done there to make sure we have the robust policies that we need to pursue our resiliency efforts. But we can't just do that domestically, right? We're talking about the global economy. So there also needs to be a big push to think about what new institutions we need to align all of our instruments, all of our institutions with close-minded partners and allies. I'm skeptical that the WTO is going to be super helpful on these instances, right? But that doesn't mean that we just like give up on a rules-based trading system. It just means we need to move the center of decision-making elsewhere. I don't think IPEF is going quite far enough to meet these objectives, right? So what's next, right? So we float the idea of economic security agreements as an idea for how we can think about really coming to those more integrated markets where we feel like it's advantageous to our hard power and our resiliency interests, and it's also providing our firms and our workers kind of those export markets that they need to be commercially competitive. So there's a lot. It's a long-term plan, I would say, right? Like none of this is going to happen in the next year or two, but we're trying to set out that broad vision of, in this reimagined world where we're talking about a different set of interests, how do we go about actually putting that into practice?
Wonderful. Thanks, Emily. So, Peter, turning to you, maybe you were sort of in the White House recently grappling with a lot of these issues. Kind of curious, anything you can share on, how is the White House thinking about some of these ideas? And then certainly also kind of, in the months that you've been out of the White House, sort of maybe how is your thinking evolving? What are sort of some of the issues you would push the White House to do more on that they haven't done yet?
No, well, first, let me really congratulate Emily and Adam and the whole CNAS team on what I think is a really thoughtful and well done report that gives quite a bit of interesting history, lays out some conceptual ways of dealing with China and the kind of pros and cons of different conceptual ways of dealing with China, and then really lays out, as Emily just said, a framework for how to think about the economic relationship, as well as in the CNAS tradition, a number of very practical recommendations for policymakers. So really, congratulations to you guys on what is a terrific and influential report. And I want to pick up on one particular recommendation and theme that I hope that the administration, whether Biden administration or former President Trump wins in November, Trump administration will pick up on, which is really this idea that the U.S. should develop an economic security strategy. Because I think you see this debate within the administration right now. For the Biden administration, when they first came in, first couple of years, I think we're still conceptually in a framework of, we want most of the economic relationship with China to be kind of commercially minded, commercial oriented. But we have this set of national security concerns that we have to take seriously in the relationship, whether it's semiconductor export controls or, investment, two-way investment flows. And you see the administration trying to define all or substantially all of its concerns through this national security lens. We've seen Secretary Yellen go out and talk about our national security concerns, but the rest being kind of commercially oriented. And I think as the U.S. has dug into and realized how important, Emily, what you refer to, and in the report you refer to as the resiliency concerns, I think that there's kind of a growing recognition that those aren't quite national security concerns, but they are also quite important. And that the way to take those concerns seriously, both so that we can address them domestically and vis-a-vis China, but also work with our allies and partners on a way to address them, is to really more fulsomely embrace an economic security paradigm that we would define and work on with our allies and partners. And I think the kind of recommendations you have there in particular are things that I hope, whoever wins in November, that the next administration will pick up on.
Can I just pick up on that? As we were looking at examples of strategy or trying to glean what the strategy is, it's like really interesting to see that, the Department of Treasury has a sanctions strategy. The Department of Defense has an industrial base strategy. Department of Commerce apparently has a national security strategy, but it's not been released, right? And like none of them are talking to each other. I mean, they're talking like the people are talking to each other, but the strategies aren't officially integrated. And that to me is just like such a striking example of like, we don't have an economic security strategy. I think people look to, the Jake Sullivan speeches as kind of the key indicator. And I think that's a good start. But that doesn't get you to the end point of if, I'm sitting in commerce or I'm sitting in any of these government offices, like how am I executing on that vision? So there's like that follow through piece that I think needs to happen in the integration across agencies as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, sort of linking it to some of the bureaucratic capacity issues as well that we've been talking about for a while. So we'll come back to that now. Adam, maybe kind of a bit more from you on sort of, how do you think China perceives some of its interests in these questions, particularly kind of, what is China getting out of ongoing dialogues with the U.S. and how do they approach these competition issues?
Right. Thanks, Jeff. So I think it may be worth to, again, go back a bit to look at how China, first of all, perceived the SCD and ED days as a broader context, right? So China really saw those dialogue mechanisms as a validation for its approach to managing the relationship with the U.S. I think a prevalent narrative at the time, by examining some of the open source research on policy statements and readouts at the time, was that greater economic interdependence had really compelled the world's largest economy and leading power to sort of accommodate China's core interests. It's also worth to note that China did use those fora to try to push for things like relaxation on export controls back in the days. But I think the current engagement series, especially under the Biden administration, I think they serve perhaps three purposes from Beijing's perspective. So one is that Beijing does want to mitigate, to an extent, the negative impact of tensions from the U.S. I think there's really this sense of claustrophobia in terms of the strengthening U.S. alliance in Indo-Pacific, with the focus on both coordinating economic and defense policies. And this sense of vulnerability has become, as a result, more acute. And secondly is that I think China, like the U.S., wants to just gain some more insights into its competitors' thinking and policymaking. And so this, in the context of upcoming presidential election cycle, is important, especially as a lot of those like U.S. trade policies, economic policies for China are still evolving and in the making. And so they want us to get a better sense of the future contours of potentially those new measures. And third, I would say, interestingly, perhaps engagement can be a deliverable for domestic audience in China, suggesting that the country is now officially out of the COVID isolation period, and this more global sort of engaging China in the world is back. So I think in that sense, dialogue itself can be an end to it. So back to you.
Great, thanks, Adam. Reminder for anyone in the audience, please do submit questions at cnas.org/live. We'll be kind of pulling those in as we go, so definitely get your questions in. I thought at the moment we've sort of had a really good discussion, but sort of relatively high level of generality and kind of theoretical framework. It'd be useful to kind of bring it to some real sort of specific immediate policy issues and sort of ask, how can we make sense of some of the current flashpoints in the relationship through this framework? So, one starting point, we have the tariffs the Biden administration recently placed, particularly on a number of strategic issues, electric vehicles, batteries, semiconductors. I guess, Emily, kind of through your framework in this report and, how would you kind of make sense of the Biden administration tariffs and sort of where do they fit into sort of maybe your three buckets and kind of, is this a good approach forward based on your framework?
Yeah, I think the conversation we're having now around electric vehicles and legacy chips are great examples of where we need to kind of continue working to fill out the policy toolkit on the resiliency interest. Right? Like we're concerned about EVs and legacy chips because we see this potential like coming flood of Chinese made EVs and legacy chips that could swamp US markets, could swamp, domestic markets. We should be concerned about this, but the direct link to national security or hard power interest is a little bit further away, right? it's not to say that there's no security component to these arguments, right? Like legacy chips are in everything, probably also in military platforms. So like there's a connection there. But I think the overriding interest is like, we just don't want to be dependent on China for any products that are going to be fundamental to our climate transition or fundamental to future energy security at a point where we have made more of a transition to clean energy technologies. And we don't want to be reliant on China for the chips, the sort of like mainstream bread and butter chips that go into like everything in this office and your office, in pretty much every component of our modernized digital society, right? That to me is a resiliency interest. And so it's been really interesting to see the actions coming out of the administration trying to grapple with this, right? Like, so we've seen the industrial policy efforts, the support and the subsidies, and trying to build up our own domestic manufacturing capacity in both EVs and maybe a little bit of legacy chips as well. And the tariffs were a really interesting step in that we don't actually see a lot of these goods coming into the U.S. market from China today. And so as we've talked about on our podcast, Jeff, they're kind of preventative tariffs, right? Like we're actually trying to get ahead of a problem for once. We can see it coming and we're trying to stem the tide. And so I think these are promising initial steps. Whether they're going to succeed, I think it's very unclear because essentially what we're talking about is Chinese overcapacity in global markets. And we're taking U.S. actions to prevent damage to our own domestic market. But there's going to be some tension there, right? It's been interesting to see how the U.S. has coordinated with the EU, for example, on some of these issues, the EU taking its own action, imposing relatively higher than expected tariffs on EVs going into the European market. So I think there's a lot of work that we still need to do, both to make sure that we're doing in the resiliency interest bucket is working for our domestic economy, and then linking up with international partners as well to align approaches.
Great, thanks, Emily. And then maybe pick up another sort of topic in the news lately on outbound investment. So just last week, we got proposed rulemaking from the Treasury Department on sort of implementing the outbound investment executive order, which sort of prohibits and restricts some certain outward U.S. investments into China in select technologies. So, Peter, maybe your thoughts on kind of where do you think the debate over outbound is going? Does sort of the administration's approach here, which is sort of, placing new restrictions, kind of creating this new tool around outbound investment, but also, trying to do it in quite a sort of targeted, narrow sense. And we sort of heard voices from the Hill and otherwise that are sort of saying, no, we should be cutting off all investment to China. Obviously, that's not the approach the Treasury is taking. Sort of, what do you think about where the sort of outbound debate is going in the broader U.S.-China relationship?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeff. So I actually want to link it to the framework that Emily has been talking about sort of hard power, resilience, and commercial interests. And I think what you're seeing with the Biden administration's outbound investment executive order, and then if you haven't seen it yet, there was a notice of proposed rulemaking, a kind of draft rule to implement the outbound regime that was released on Friday. And I think the administration is going to solicit comments through early August, and will then try to finalize this before the end of the year. But the administration is thinking about outbound investment in that first bucket, that kind of hard power bucket. And so they've made a decision to limit investments in semiconductors, in certain kinds of AI, and in quantum, because they see these as key current and future technologies that, as Emily said earlier, the U.S. wants to have overmatch in. And by preventing U.S. firms from investing in some of these technologies, and by requiring U.S. firms to notify the U.S. government of other kinds of investments in these technologies, the U.S. government is trying to ensure that U.S. know-how, expertise, and capital is not facilitating China's development of these technologies. But I think where one of the points of debate here in Washington is between the administration and some of the folks who would like to see a broader outbound action is whether we should also be thinking about outbound investment restrictions as a tool in that resiliency bucket. And should we also be saying, if we don't want to be dependent on China in electric vehicles, for example, or we don't want to be dependent on China in, pharmaceutical and drugs, maybe we should also be restricting American firms from investing in those sectors, because if you're going to have the investments in those sectors, it's actually going to contribute to those dependencies and undermining resilience, or at least that's the argument. I think the administration's perspective is, no, we have other tools to deal with these resiliency issues, and we should keep this focused on critical kind of economic and technological overmatch sectors. But I think that is really the crux of the debate that we're going to see play out about how broad we should go on outbound over the next, not couple of months, because that'll be implementation of the administration's rule, but couple of years as this evolves.
Great, thanks, Peter. So we've talked a fair bit on sort of obviously the U.S. China relationship. Point you make in the report, Emily, is that sort of third countries, particularly U.S. partners and allies, really matter here as well. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on sort of where do you think partners and allies are on the sort of broader approach to China. This administration is doing a lot to try and bring sort of the G7 countries along with them on their approach to China. I think kind of some mixed results there, but kind of curious your thoughts on where are partners and allies and where are they going broadly.
Yeah, the short answer is it depends, but I'll give a little more nuance to that answer. I think in many of our closest partners, and certainly within the G7 and with our Five Eyes partners, right? Like there's been a shift and a hardening towards China, right? Like I was just in Australia last week, for example, and I can't tell you how much the Chinese coercion and the embargoes against Australian wine and barley in response to just Australia calling for an investigation into the origins of COVID, like that has really hardened attitudes in the Australian policy circles against China, even as they're trying to kind of stabilize the relationship and and kind of get back to business as usual. Like I think there's been a switch has flipped in that system and it's not going back. I think you're seeing something similar in Europe, candidly, a little bit slower and a little bit more patchy as you think about all the countries that make up Europe. But I think here again, like China's own actions have really undermined its interest as you think about their support of Russia and kind of the existential crisis that Europe is feeling because of Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine. And so I think that's sharpening attitudes in Europe as well. And then, of course, you look at, Japan, who's been a leader on economic security issues, right? So I think the conversation has been moving in the right direction and moving towards more alignment with the U.S. on at least a broad agreement that China is a strategic, a threat, and that there's room for economic security measures and national security measures taken in the economic space to kind of deal with that threat. Now, where I see much more divergence, and I'd be curious Peter's thought on this as well, because I know he's having his own conversations with international counterparts, is like, what do you do about it? What are the specific things that you implement in order to respond to that, right? Like, I think we're having a harder time than we would like on things like alignment on export controls. It took the administration a lot of energy and political capital to get at least some alignment with the Dutch and the Japanese on the tooling controls in the semiconductor space. And that took a while, and that is one set of technologies, right? On outbound investment, as Peter was just talking about, I think there's promising signals here and there. But I think there's also a lot of skepticism, candidly. Like you go to Europe and you talk to them about outbound investment and their response is basically like, well, we don't have venture capital. So what's the problem? Like we don't have a Silicon Valley the way that you guys do. So I think there's a lot of work still to kind of go from that, increasing strategic alignment where there's still some work to do there, but at least it's heading in the right direction to really getting into the specific nuts and bolts of the economic connections between all of our partners and China and where those present vulnerabilities, and then how you apply a policy tool on top of that to address the risks. And I think that's where a lot of the work still needs to be done. But I'd be very curious Peter's thoughts on this question.
I very much agree, Emily, with what you said. I think if you look across the G7, you have the major industrial economies, you are today seeing a high degree of strategic alignment on both the kind of economic and security challenges that China poses. I think you saw that just with the G7 statement a couple of weeks ago coming out of the summit, where I think it referenced China 34 times. I remember at the beginning of the Biden administration, it was essentially impossible to get the G7 statements to say the word China. They were still, non-market economy practices is what the Europeans wanted to talk about. And I think that really reflects the way between the sort of Europe and other G7 countries feeling the economic pressure from China, China's saber rattling vis-a-vis Taiwan, and also, frankly, China's deepening its ties to Russia has contributed to this kind of G7 strategic alignment. But I very much also agree with Emily that the kind of mechanics of the what to do about it continue to vary quite a bit, where I think it is difficult for Europe, given, China feels further away to them than it does to us. They're not a Pacific, Europe's not a Pacific continent. We are a Pacific facing continent, so it feels further away to them. And I think the commercial interests they have are quite significant. And so they just aren't quite where we are in terms of many of the specific policy measures that we'd like to take. I think that's different from a Japan, right? Japan, I think, is quite aligned with us both strategically and in many respects on specific actions that Japan's willing to take. So I think we're going to continue to see that dynamic where some of our allies are closer to us in the mechanics than some others. And it's just going to be incumbent on diplomats going forward to, just kind of keep pushing the rock up the hill of getting our allies on board with the specific actions.
Okay, thanks. So we will go to questions from the audience in a moment. So a reminder to keep getting those in. But first, Adam, kind of curious to get your thoughts. So obviously, you and Emily lay out a series of recommendations in this report for U.S. to undertake. Kind of how do you think China might respond if the U.S. kind of does implement this policy agenda? And sort of obviously it's a two-player game. We want to sort of think about what their response would be, both kind of retaliation and any sort of like carrots that China may have on its side. So how would China react to this?
Certainly. Thanks, Jeff. So I would say perhaps in three broad areas of response, and many of which has already been in the process, right? So one is, I would say, building up its own arsenal of regulatory tools as potentially this, measure to really focused on keeping U.S. businesses and Western business in general in the middle. Secondly, doubling down on industrial policy, and thirdly, China also have this, this urge to balancing, national security-driven policies with, this need to bring back more FDI business investment into its market. Just a little bit more on the first area, I would say, on the arsenals. It appears that China really has had a hard time trying to figure out an effective way to respond to, I think what can be seen as a more aggressive U.S. trade policy toward China. And so it has landed on building out its own arsenal of regulatory tools to put pressure on business with still strong commercial interests in the Chinese market, through statutes such as export control law, anti-sanction law, tariff law, and so on. And at the same time, China has been calling out the U.S. and I paraphrase that as violating fundamental WTO rules and spirit, and has been calling itself as a champion for free global trade, saying that things like it exports too much simply because it has the comparative advantage in sectors like EVs. So some of the responses there.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Adam. So let's pull in a few audience questions here. So we've got a great question from Elizabeth, who asks, is there a future for U.S. leadership in the WTO dispute settlement system, or will the U.S. resort to other methods for trade dispute resolution with China? How does national security shape the U.S.'s evolution on this issue? So kind of where's the WTO fit in the sort of future of this world? So, Emily, happy to hear from you first on that, and then kind of Peter, Adam, if you want to join in as well.
Yeah, I think the answer is both. I don't think that we can give up on the WTO. Most trade around the world is still conducted under terms governed by the WTO. It matters a lot for many of our partners and allies, particularly mid-sized partners, right? So we need to find a way to make the WTO work. And that includes resolving the impasse around dispute settlement. At the same time, we should be quite clear-eyed about the fact that the WTO is not going to solve either our economic or our security challenges with China, right? And so we need to move outside the WTO as we're thinking about those interests in that particular relationship. One idea we talk about in the report is whether we could actually make better use of the Phase 1 agreement that was negotiated under the Trump administration between the United States and China. That was a very different agreement. It's not a traditional free trade agreement by most metrics, but one of the things that it did was it set up a dispute settlement process bilaterally between the United States and China. That's essentially a political process. There's no independent panel, there's no arbitration. It is a consultative, process between the two governments, and then a kind of unilateral right to impose remedies as is seen appropriate. We don't know if it would work. It's never been used, right? The Trump administration didn't use it before the end of its term. The Biden administration hasn't used it. But I do think it's worth considering avenues like that, because I have a hard time seeing how either the US or China would feel comfortable with, like, for example, the WTO opining on a case in which either side invokes national security interests, right? Like, that's not going to solve the impasse. Maybe we do need to just accept that these are going to be politically solved issues and take them out of the WTO and actually put them in more of a political process as is set up under the phase one agreement for, for things that are actually covered under the phase one agreement disciplines. So I think that's an idea that's worthy of consideration, both because that will deal with the U.S. China issues a bit more effectively, I think, and it's also going to take some of the pressure off of the WTO, right? Like, let's let the WTO do what it is better designed to do, and it is not designed to deal with U.S. China geopolitical competition.
Peter, anything you want to add on future WTO?
I'd just pick up on a point that Emily made, which I actually think the U.S. and China have effectively made a decision going back to about 2019 now, so 4 or 5 years ago, that we are going to resolve our disputes outside the WTO. And in fact, we're governing our trade outside the WTO. Our tariff rates on China, because of Trump's 301 tariffs, which Biden has now increased, are not WTO compliant, right? They're not the bound rates we agreed to in the WTO. And I don't think there's really any serious talk about going back to bound rates vis-a-vis China. And then, as Emily says, we've also essentially agreed to settle that dispute over what we're doing outside the WTO, where we had a phase one trade deal. We have bilateral consultations. Yes, China has filed a couple of cases at the WTO against specific U.S. actions, including most recently an action against the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, but they're not pursuing those particularly aggressively. They're not pushing to get panels. They're not pushing to have the WTO actually issue kind of written opinions on that, because I think the countries have kind of decided we're just going to navigate the U.S.-China bilateral economic relationship outside the WTO, and I don't think that's going to change. I think where it gets challenging is how do we deal with the WTO rules vis-a-vis other potentially allied trading partners, and kind of, the European Union, for example, has decided not to challenge the IRA, at least to date, but I think would have grounds to challenge some of the IRA provisions as they impact potential European exports to the U.S. So I actually think it's going to be quite complicated. To me, the complexity with the WTO is not so much U.S. China, because we've just sort of pulled our own disputes out of the WTO. The question is, how do we square some of the actions we, the U.S., are taking domestically to address China, but that also have spillover impacts on allies and partners? How do we deal with those kinds of issues in a multilateral context?
Great, thanks, Peter. So I have a question here from Jack on the private sector. So Jack asks, how do you see the future for U.S. companies running their businesses in China and vice versa here in the United States? And be able to sort of add on to that a little bit to think, more generally, sort of what do you see the role of the private sector in the economic security strategy and implementing economic security policies? And how should policymakers think about kind of balancing sort of the important role of industry and kind of engagement there with some of these sort of national security concerns? Emily, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can start on this. Look, I think it's going to be bumpy for U.S. companies in China. And I think many of them realize that. And that's something that the chip companies and I think the financial companies have been awake to for at least a few years now, right? But I think all companies are now, starting to realize that, whether it's because of geopolitics or just candidly, like China's own management of its domestic economic issues, like China is a much more difficult, much riskier market than it used to be. And I think just doing one thing that we talk about with our private sector friends all the time is like doing a range of scenario planning, making sure that you're really thinking ahead 5 to 10 years. If geopolitics tracks one way or another, and then you layer on top of that, China's own responses to its economic downturn, like what does that look like for your business? And like, is that calculus worth it anymore? And I do think companies are starting to take that much more seriously. I think you see that in the FDI numbers, candidly, which are just like falling off a cliff in terms of foreign FDI into China. And I don't see those trends getting significantly better anytime soon, right? In terms of governments and policymakers working with the private sector, it's absolutely fundamental. Like it has to happen, right? Like what we're essentially talking about is trying to reshape global supply chains that governments don't control. Like the private sector controls these. They know where the supply chains are. They're going to have to be the ones that move them, right? And so how do government interventions nudge them or force them, whether it's through regulation or incentives or just public-private partnership, information sharing, right? There's a range of things that the government can do, but it absolutely has to be in partnership with the private sector. And the private sector, I think, has to acknowledge there's going to be some costs with this. Like, this is not going to be a cost-free transition. If it was, like, this would be a much easier conversation for all of us.
Great, thanks. Got another question here from Ben. So Ben asks, how do you think China's current economic recession could impact relations between the U.S. and China? Adam, do you want to take first crack at that?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. I think, well, first of all, an economy of China's size, even if it's growing significantly slower than it used to be, right? It's still quite a sizable economy, right? Growing at perhaps 5% annual GDP growth rate, if we can trust the number. But I do think that policymakers in China are probably facing a dilemma, right? I mean, you have this aging society, fast aging society without enough social safety net. You need to spend more there. And at the same time, you're in this sort of what they see as this prolonged competition with the U.S. for, supremacy in multiple domains. And then industrial policies is a key part in supporting your progress there. Local governments are such active agency in carrying out those plans, but at the same time, we see surging amount of debt at the local level in China. So there's definitely a whole host of questions on how sustainable China's strategy is economically. I think, I do think in terms of sort of the ongoing dialogues with the U.S., it doesn't seem as if China is always coming from the position of strength. It doesn't look like that. So.
Great, thanks, Adam. So take one more question here from Patrick. So focused on Taiwan. So Patrick asks, with all the work the administration is doing on harmonizing export controls, why is there not more focus on Taiwan, particularly as Taiwan has existing restrictions on outbound and investment screening and restrictions on R&D in China? Patrick asks, seems like all the harmonizing talk doesn't treat Taiwan like the strong equal partner that they are. So Emily, Peter, Adam, any thoughts on sort of how we can better align with Taiwan here, obviously given the kind of complicated Taiwan-specific dynamics there?
Well, I'll just start by making one point, which is I actually think when the Biden administration was looking at its outbound investment and JV, NPRM covers JVs as well as investments policy, Taiwan was actually a model it looked at. I think there was often this kind of discussion here in Washington of, there's never been in the history of the world controls on outbound investment, and how could the U.S. government actually think about this? And one of the responses you heard from U.S. government officials, well, actually, Taiwan has done some of this, and so this would not actually be U.S. being a first mover. There are precedents out there that we could look at, and I think sort of Taiwan's experience of developing a very successful semiconductor industry in particular, having deep trade relationships with China, but using targeted restrictions on R&D, outbound, and export controls to make sure that industry stays in Taiwan and doesn't sort of fully leak over and get taken over by China, is a very valuable and important model for the U.S. to study. I think it probably, and Jeff, the way you frame the question kind of gets at the crux. I think it doesn't always get talked about as publicly as, say, alignment with South Korea or alignment with the Netherlands because of the diplomatic complexity that Taiwan brings. And so I actually think this is one where U.S. government does work very closely with Taiwan, wants to work closely with Taiwan, has looked at what Taiwan is doing, but doesn't necessarily want Taiwan in all the rooms where these things are discussed, not so much from a U.S. government perspective, because if Taiwan is in that room, it might actually be a little bit harder for some of the other countries, given their own diplomatic relationships, to participate.
Great, yeah, and I'd add on that, of course, we have negotiations on the U.S. China 21st Century Trade Agreement with Taiwan, which is maybe the only trade agreement getting kind of bipartisan support on the Hill these days. So there's some action there on Taiwan. So we're about out of time, so I think we'll wrap up. Again, huge thanks to Emily, Peter, and Adam for joining us. We'll give you all a last word. Maybe we'll go kind of reverse order. So Adam, then Peter, then Emily.
All right, thanks. I'll just perhaps very quickly venture to say that, well, personally, I think really trade, economic relationship more broadly between the U.S. and China has long served as this, sort of a ballast in the broader U.S.-China relationship, where you have areas and domains that would otherwise be characterized by differences that are just fundamentally irreconcilable. So I think with the securitization of the economic relationship, also at this point, we're probably really in for a period of time of greater uncertainty.
Peter?
Yeah, well, I just want to congratulate CNAS and Emily and Adam in particular again on a great report that I think is really important, in part because actually to highlight another piece of recent CNAS work, a point that CNAS's president Richard Fontaine made in a recent book just out in the last couple of weeks. He has a new book out on kind of the lessons of the pivot to Asia over the last decade. And a point that comes through very clearly there is that for everything that's happened over the last 7-8 years on the economic front and technology front between the US and China, we are still in the early days of rethinking what this relationship will look like. And we have, probably 20 years ahead of us of a very different kind of technological and economic relationship with China than we did in the 1990s, 2000s. And so that makes it all the more important for the work that Emily and Adam have done. And while some of the recommendations are big and will take time to implement, we actually have the time and have to get them implemented.
Great. Thanks, Emily.
Well, I'm always going to invite Peter back because he says such nice things about our work. So thank you, Peter. And I will return the favor by again commending your recent work at Carnegie, which, kind of has a different starting point at looking at some of these same issues. But I think we kind of, wind our way around to very similar recommendations and themes. So it's been great to work with you on these issues. I guess to wrap up, I would just say, it is a generational challenge, right? These are big, thorny issues, but what we're essentially talking about is resetting the global economic order. That is no small task. And I think we can only really do that if we get better at bridging the economic and the security communities. I mean, that's something that we tried to do through this project. It's something that is a core focus of our program here at CNAS. It is why we have an economics program at the Center for a New American Security that focuses on national security issues, right? We think that sort of bridging of communities and expertise is what we need to do in this geopolitical moment. So excited to kind of continue the conversation with this group of experts that we've convened and everyone else who's interested in these issues.
Great, wonderful. Thanks again to all of you. So reminder, the new report, Disorderly Conduct, How U.S.-China Competition Upended the International Economic Order and What the United States Can Do About It, is available on the CNAS website, so go get it now. Also reminder to please check out De-Risky Business, the podcast Emily and I have released, and that will be sort of in the feed. This conversation will be there next week. Thanks as well to the CNAS communications team for all of their great support in putting together this event. And as we wrap up and close out here, we will leave you with a short video which is summarizing a separate CNAS project, which is on the U.S.-China economic relationship. No winners in this game. Focus on the potential role of sanctions in deterring China from war over Taiwan. So we will play that as we close out here. Thanks again to everybody, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks all. All right.
Thanks all.
Tensions between the United States and the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, are rising, and Washington is increasingly concerned about the possibility of a clash over Taiwan. The United States would look to sanctions as one tool to manage a crisis with the PRC. But would sanctions work? And can the United States and its international partners impose harsh sanctions without crushing their own economies? To explore this, the CNAS economics team developed a strategy game to explore how countries might use sanctions in a potential conflict over Taiwan. Players used economic tools to influence each other's actions while mitigating damage to their own economies. The U.S. and partner teams quickly escalated to severe sanctions, including an attack on China's financial sector, weaponizing the critical role of the U.S. dollar in global financial architecture and boxing the PRC team into a defensive posture. The PRC team retaliated against foreign firms in China and cut off trade in critical goods, exploiting their essential role as a global manufacturer. These actions came with costs so high that the United States and its partners may not be able to credibly threaten similar sanctions under real-world conditions. Washington is in a bind, knowing that limited sanctions will not deter China, but fearing the economic consequences of a high-intensity sanctions strategy. A hesitation to signal clear and strong resolve to impose devastating sanctions well in advance of a crisis will seriously undermine the deterrent power of sanctions. The United States and its partners must prepare now for potential sanctions as part of a broader strategy to use all instruments of national power to deter the PRC from aggression. Read the full report at cnas.org.